one of the major reasons, dynamics, that have kept Afghanistan in turmoil for decades. And so what happened? The situation got worse and worse. The chaos got worse and worse. During this time, I was one of the few who did not turn my head and walk away. I kept looking for a way out of the insanity and chaos, and yes, there was a way out, but it was a path the Saudis and the Pakistanis did not want to take. There was one man revered by almost all Afghan people, of every faction and every tribe. It was King Zahir Shah, the king who is in exile, who had led his country for 4 decades of peace and stability. When he was overthrown, Afghanistan ended up in decades of chaos and bloodletting and invasions on a massive scale. During that time, King Zahir Shah, after he was deposed in a coup, he ended up living in exile in Rome. I met with him there on a number of occasions in the 1990s. He was the obvious leader to bring peace and stability to his bloody and torn country, but not so obvious to the Pakistanis, who wanted to dominate and control Afghanistan. Not so obvious to the Saudis, who were doing the bidding of the most violent and anti-Western manifestations of Islamic fascism. And not so obvious to the Clinton administration, whose goal was to go along with the Saudis and the Pakistanis. I personally argued my case to Prince Turki, then the head of the Saudi CIA. Prince Turki, who had been very involved with supporting the anti-Soviet Mujahideen during the war against Soviet occupation. I begged with him and pleaded with everyone else who would listen. King Zahir Shah was a moderate Muslim leader who would bring peace and stability. No, what the Saudis and the Pakistanis wanted was a radical Islamic force that would supposedly unite the devout Muslims of Afghanistan, but more importantly, would be a Pakistani and Saudi ally, an ally who would be willing to do their bidding. And what did the Clinton administration do? What did the Clinton administration want? Well, what they wanted was to make the Saudis and the Pakistanis happy. So, in the mid-1990s, the Taliban emerged. They are not the same as the Mujahideen. Many Americans mistakenly believe that the people who fought against the Soviet army were named the Mujahideen, later became the Taliban. By and large, it was the Mujahideen later on who drove the Taliban out of power. It was the Taliban had been kept as a reserve force, you might say, going to these madrasa schools in Pakistan until after the Soviets had been defeated. The lion's share of Mujahideen leaders who fought against the Soviet troops were not part of the Taliban. Well, I hoped for the best after it was clear that the Taliban were anointed by the Clinton administration, by the Saudis and the Pakistanis, and they took over Kabul, the capital city of Afghanistan. I hoped for the best for about 2 weeks. I was just hoping people told me, no, maybe they'll come through. Maybe they'll start moderating. But my worst nightmares began to come true after just a few weeks. A brutal fundamentalist Islamic movement that hated the West was taking control of Afghanistan, supported by the United States government in the name of stability. That was it. In the name of stability, we're going to support these radical fundamentalists and other tyrannical forces. For several years, at this time in the 1990s, I was a voice in the wilderness here in the House, warning that the creation and support of the Taliban would come back to haunt us someday. I had no idea how true these warnings were and how much it would hurt us. During that time in the 1990s, I met with the leaders of Afghan tribes and ethnic groups in and out of Afghanistan in an effort to forge an anti-Taliban coalition. The core of the plan was to bring back Zahir Shah, King Zahir Shah, the focal point for dislodging the Taliban, someone everyone could rally around, who would treat people fairly and create a peaceful, more democratic country. At the end of the year 2000, after a Herculean effort, there was a meeting that had been arranged of all the Afghan factions except for the Taliban. After that meeting, King Zahir Shah agreed to return to Afghanistan to hold a Loya Jirga in July of 2001. The Loya Jirga, let me note, is a convention of tribal elders which was to take place in the territory that was controlled by Commander Massoud. Commander Massoud is a man who was never beaten by the Soviets. He was also never beaten by the Taliban, and he was one of the last commanders that held any part of territory in Afghanistan. The rest was controlled by the Taliban. Considering this agreement of Zahir Shah to go to Commander Massoud's territory and have a Loya Jirga to talk about the future governance of Afghanistan, this was a great step forward. And this agreement was forged despite the opposition of the Clinton administration. And it was a great accomplishment just to get that agreement. Those involved in making this happen included International Relations Committee Chairman Ben Gilman, Tom Lantos, a senior member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as a few others, but just a few. After George W. Bush was elected, I was able to meet several times with his new National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, who I knew from the Reagan days. Well, we discussed Russia and we talked extensively about Afghanistan. I pitched the idea of overthrowing the Taliban using the coalition that I'd been building, the anti-Taliban coalition. Well, the idea wasn't rejected, but no action was taken, at least until 9/11. The 9/11 slaughter of 3,000 Americans was planned and set in motion by bin Laden's al-Qaeda terrorist network, then allied with the Taliban, headquartered there in Afghanistan and operating freely in that country. On 9/11, I was given an incredible opportunity to utilize the knowledge that I had gained and the relationships I had built in that region over the many years. It was the opportunity to make a significant difference for my country at a time of great chaos and crisis. Only a few days before, al-Qaeda Taliban assassins had murdered Commander Massoud. I had met with Commander Massoud in Afghanistan in one of my several forays into Afghanistan during the 1990s. I visited him in a mountain hideout, his retreat, or his fortress, you might say, there, and we talked for a long time. We had been in contact ever since the time when in the Reagan White House when he sent his brother to see me. Well, and we had negotiated and kept in touch verbally, but that was the first time I met him. Our friendship was already in existence, and by that meeting it really was solidified. And then Commander Massoud, in the days before 9/11, when we'd been looking forward to having this meeting in his territory with the king, Commander Massoud was blown apart in an assassination scheme, of course, Taliban and al-Qaeda scheme. And I remember then how much despair that I was in, that this great man who held such promise to be a leader of his country, like others who were killed during the war against the Russians and now the Taliban. So many young leaders killed in Afghanistan, brave men. Later on, Abdul Haq lost his life. But Commander Massoud, I sat down in my office in total despair, and I said, I've got to get control of myself. Why did they kill him? Why did they do that now? And I thought it out, and I realized that they had killed Commander Massoud in order to prevent the United States from having an avenue to counterattack against them for something that they were going to do to us. It made all the sense in the world. They were going to have a major attack on the United States, and it must have been something that was going to be humongous and cause much loss of life, or they wouldn't have gone out of the way to kill Commander Massoud, because we wouldn't have wanted to try to retaliate against them, to use him to retaliate against them for something they did to us. Well, yes, that was exactly the case. And I realized there would be a monstrous attack on the United States, so I immediately called the White House. I called the White House. I called for National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, and her assistant came on the phone and said, Congressman Rohrabacher, what is it? And I said, I've got to see her. I've got to warn her about an imminent major terrorist attack that is going to happen very soon in our country. There will be a huge terrorist attack. I need to talk to her about it and give her some